Welcome to this first Repair lecture. This lecture is part of an interdisciplinary lecture series about reparations demands and policies around the world. The lectures provided here are given by leading reparations experts, and they investigate how reparations claims and policies come about, how they play out from a political, economic, and moral perspective, and what they may teach us about politics and economics today. These lectures are hosted by the Repair Project, funded by the European Research Council, and they're based at the Anthropology Department of the University of Amsterdam. This lecture is also being recorded. It will be put online, but the Q&A will not be recorded, so please feel free to ask any question that you may have, both in the chat or here in person. If you would like to ask a question in person, please join the mic right next to Musumi. And today we have the great honor of having Professor Jean-Benoît Falisse with us. Jean-Benoît is a senior lecturer in African Studies and International Development at the University of Edinburgh. There he also serves as the co-director of the Center of African Studies. And usually his research examines the political economy and governance of basic social service provision in fragile and conflict-affected societies. But over the last 3 years, Jean-Benoît has done something new. He's been conducting research on reparations, serving as the principal investigator of 4 reparations evaluations commissioned by the Trust Fund for Victims of the International Criminal Court at The Hague. And today's lecture will present findings from one of these evaluations, focusing on reparations to people in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where inhabitants of Bogoro village in the eastern province Ituri were attacked in February 2003 by an armed paramilitary group led by Germain Katanga. And the ICC issued an order for reparations, awarding both individual and collective reparations to the victims of the Bogoro attack. And Jean-Benoît will tell us more about this now, so please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
So my lecture today will be first and foremost empirical, and this is for 2 reasons. The first one is very much on the slide. This is a quote from sociologist John Tolpe, which was kindly provided by Felix almost 20 years ago, but I think this is still very much valid. So there simply isn't much research at all on reparations, or the consequences of reparations, rather. So the main piece of research that I found in recent years is a piece by development economists Guarin, Londoño, Vélez, and Pozo in Argentina, which is interesting. This is looking at what the money of reparation does, what people use it for. But to me, this is not answering some of the core questions. What are good reparations? How much do reparations repair? What do they repair, if anything at all? I'm not quite sure why there isn't more research on the consequences of reparations. If you've got ideas, I'd be very happy to discuss that in the Q&A. Second reason why my presentation will be first and foremost empirical, simply because I'm starting with this, and we started with a lot of empirical research, a lot of field work. So what I want to do today is perhaps a bit ambitious, so bear with me. First, I would like to briefly present the case, so the Katanga case before the ICC, and then tell you a little bit about the kind of research that we did and what we found, basically the gist of the report, if you want. What do we know of the consequences of the Katanga reparations? And then I've come up with 5 discussion themes, which is probably at least 4 too many, but I felt that because this is an inaugural lecture to some extent, it would help us, raise key interesting questions about reparations, which I think Felix, your team will engage with in the coming years. So next slide, please. So on the 24th of February 2003, the village of Bogoro, located a dozen kilometers south of Bunia, the capital of the present-day province of Ituri in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, was attacked by elements of the Force de Résistance Patriotique d'Ituri, an armed group led by Germain Katanga. The armed assault led to the death of scores of civilians, including children, and the destruction of property. Following the issue of an arrest warrant by International Criminal Court, Mr Katanga, whom the DRC government had already arrested, was transferred to The Hague, the Netherlands, into ICC custody in October 2007. In the ensuing 7 years, and based on a judicial process in which Mr Katanga benefited from legal counsel, he was tried and found guilty as an accessory of 1 count of crimes against humanity and 4 counts of war crimes, namely murder, attacking a civilian population, destruction of property, and pillaging. He was sentenced to 12 years in imprisonment on the 23rd of May 2014, and in December 2015, 8 years after being transferred to The Hague, Mr. Katanga was sent to the DRC. The ICC's terms of imprisonment imposed on Mr. Katanga ended on the 18th of January 2016. That's for the background slide. And this is where we start the story, in a sense, or where we could start the story. I'll tell you a bit more about that later on. What happened then at the ICC is that a draft a reparation order was issued against Mr. Katanga, and that reparation order was in the amount of $1 million, awarding both individual and collective reparations to the victims of the Bogoro attack. So the ICC process is that a reparation order is issued, and after that you've got an implementation plan. The Trust Fund for Victims, which is a part of the ICC in charge of reparations, comes up with a plan for implementing reparations. The draft implementation plan came soon after. I'll present the timeline in a minute. And this is what the reparations aim to do according to this reparation order. It's to provide victims with a strengthened ability to cope with the livelihood, financial, and psychological trauma caused by Mr. Katanga's crime and the aftermath. So that draft implementation plan was formulated. By the way, it's called drafts and remained called a draft until the end of the process, which seems a bit peculiar, but it's really linked to the intricacies of the ICC. And, you know, part of the plan being approved, and then they carry on and they approved other bits, and it just remained called the draft until the end. I'm not sure this is actually a really important thing. Initially, I thought, oh, this is really interesting and important. I'm not so sure about that anymore. It's just called a draft implementation plan. I think what's interesting to see here is that the plan exists. It sets sort of general aims, but it doesn't provide any real benchmark, right? It doesn't really let us know how would we know whether reparations are successful or not. We've got this very general principles. And, you know, what would constitute a satisfactory strengthened ability? This is quite vague. Is it a problem or not? It's maybe something we can pick up in the Q&A, but I think it's an important point. A process of reparation is set in motion, but not necessarily with the tools to understand or to assess whether it will be a success or a failure. There are a few specificities in the Katanga case, as there will be for any reparation case. So in this situation, we had a relatively small number of victims, 297 recognized victims. This is a very small number comparing to pretty much any reparation scheme that you can think of. We had what was described as a define, choose, and change approach to the collective reparations. So essentially, a system whereby victims could decide of a modality of reparation, and as time evolves, just pick another one if they felt like it, right? So, and victims did in fact change their mind in a sense a few times during the process. So the reparations consisted in a first symbolic award, what's called a symbolic award. That's a lump sum, a cash sum of $250 US. So it's distributed to all the victims. And then the collective awards, this is the one for which you can define, choose, and change. And the collective awards were either about education assistance or housing assistance or income generating activities. Many different forms of income generating activities. Some people wanted to buy cattle. Some people wanted to buy a motorbike to start a business. Many different options there. Now, these awards are called collective, which is a bit peculiar because, in fact, they're very much individualized. And again, this is linked to the intricacies of the ICC and the way it works. And it kind of shows the kind of back and forth between the different parties at the ICC with this original idea of going for collective reparations, but eventually settling for something that's a lot more individualized. So in all ICC literature, this is referred to as collective reparations, but this is very much an individual reparation too. And then the third part of the reparations was psychological support. It came at the very end, and victims could opt out if they wanted, but they could not swap that for anything else. They could attend the sessions if they wanted, but didn't have to. This gives you a sense on my slides of the financial value of the reparations. The categories are set by the ICC. And I think what you can immediately see here is that in the sort of decision that was made by the judge using kind of damage and compensation rationale, you would get more money if you lost your home or livestock than if you lost a family member, for instance. Right? Loss of personal affairs. I strongly suspect this is a bad translation from French at the ICC. What they mean is loss of personal belongings, just in case you were wondering. This gives you a sense of how the Katanga reparations unfolded. So the Bogoro attack was in 2003, and then, as I explained, the trial started only towards the end of 2009, and then the reparations only finished this year. So a pretty long, pretty stretched timeline. What is the sort of research that we did? As I said, we were asked by the ICC to evaluate this set of reparations. I am not really an anthropologist. I'm a social scientist mixing different disciplines by training. And the key challenge is with any evaluation is the question of attribution. How can we link the reparations to certain outcomes? And as you will know better than me, there are many different ways of doing this, many different epistemologies, even ontologies, underpinning evaluation research. We decided to follow two different approaches, which could be seen as contradictory if you're coming, if you're interested in the epistemological bits. But I think that worked. The first one was simply to listen to narratives, to simply talk to people, understand what is their history, how did it go for them, and do what people would call process tracing, so trying to relate their present day experience to their experience of the reparations. And the other one is more of a comparative approach, basically comparing the situation of Katanga victims with the situation of people who suffered similar harm but were not recognized by the court, often because they were not Katanga victims. So very sadly, in a part of the world like Ituri, it's not hard to find people who suffered very similar harm but never got access to court, let alone reparations. So, right, so we've got the basic kind of control and intervention group, if you want to use that sort of terminology. You can see on my slide the kind of methods that we use in the field. So the survey, the survey with 355 victims was a bit challenging. We never got the full list of victims. The legal representatives of the victims did not want to share that, but through intermediaries, we eventually managed to access victims. And then focus group discussions, interviews with key stakeholders. I mean, there's nothing here that is groundbreaking in terms of research methods, I think. How well did the reparations go? What I'm going to try to do here is really sum up my report in hopefully 10 minutes. So how well did the reparations go? I think, generally speaking, it was a long, tedious process, but the overall engagement with the Trust Fund for Victims, with the ICC, with the legal representative for victims, was described by victims as being generally good. And I think this is important to stress. It was a difficult process, but overall, there was a certain level of trust that was maintained throughout, and victims generally spoke positively of the Trust Fund for Victims, and especially of the legal representatives. So communication was described as, generally fair, generally good. This is not obviously to say that there was a very smooth and easy process, far from it. The procurement process for providing the goods and services to the victims was extremely complicated. Took a lot of time, and if you factor in inflation, it meant that the victims felt that they basically did not receive all they were promised. It was also a process that generated some expectations. I will return to that later. Expectations that probably were not met until the end, and are still not met. And a key element for people to hang on to it, if you want to cling to it, to feel that they were still part of it, was on the one hand the extremely good communication with the legal representative for victims, the lawyer, the person who defended some of them, not defended, who represented some of them in court and kept working with them throughout the process, and who really was engaged in very regular communication through his Congolese team. And then what I put on the slide, this initial symbolic award of $250 was really crucial for people to believe in it, to believe in the process. So, well, this is actually serious. They've given us that money, so the rest is taking a long time to come, but it's real. What have the reparations achieved? And again, you can read my report or our report if you want to know more about this. But in a nutshell, in terms of financial situation and livelihoods, the reparations have had limited effects. So we don't find that victims are necessarily much better off than the rest of the population, and they don't describe themselves as much better off. But we do find that they're slightly better at coping with shocks. So basically, they're less likely to say that they resort to extreme measures when faced with difficulties. Extreme measures would be catastrophic expenditures, to selling goods because you basically need to eat or get urgent medical care, or maybe, I know, we could be engaged in illegal activities, take a shark loan. I mean, you can imagine all sorts of extreme measures. Basically, they're less likely to do that. What we think happened is that in the context of violence and precarity, basically all the new assets provided to the victims were used very quickly. So they basically had no choice but to use that, and they used that to cope with shocks. So they did not get much better off, but at least they could deal with some of the very difficult circumstances they find themselves in. And as I mentioned earlier, the different delays, the inflation also meant that a lot of what was provided was effectively of lesser value than initially envisaged. We find some possible positive effects on social life. So victims explained in the interviews how they bond together, how they formed associations of victims, and how this is beneficial to them. We also find indications in both the quantitative and the qualitative material of increased trust in key institutions, obviously the ICC, obviously the justice system, but also local authorities, NGOs, and others. We don't find much of a difference between beneficiaries of reparations and non-beneficiaries in terms of access to basic social services, so healthcare, education. It doesn't seem that the reparations made a big difference. The area in which we probably see the most important effects is in terms of mental health, in terms of well-being. I won't spend too much time on that chart. Basically, this is using different indices of well-being, and we see that systematically beneficiaries of reparations are doing better than non-beneficiaries. And this is also consistent with what we heard in the focus groups and in the interviews. So what's really interesting here is that this is coming, if you remember my timeline, this is coming even before the psychological intervention started. So this is really, we think, coming from the fact that they are being recognized as victims, and that affects then well-being and mental health. The hardest and possibly the most interesting question, however, is about people's sense of justice. Did the reparation bring a sense of reparation and justice? And so the quotes, I think, on my slide are quite indicative. This is again a story of recognition. and a story of recognition through, I would say, two different channels. The first one is a trial in and of itself. And I think this should lead us to rethink the timeline of reparations. When do reparations actually start? I have a point about that a bit later. But this is also, and I think this is important because of the repeated engagement throughout the process of the legal representatives, but also of the trust fund for victims. So I think this notion of being recognized is coming not from a one-off event, but is coming from repeated engagements throughout the process. So in a sense, you could say that the delays brought more interactions. Is that a good thing? Well, we could discuss that, but the fact there was a long process also meant that there were many points at which victims engaged with the legal representatives and the trust fund for victims. So a general sense of satisfaction, as the lawyers would say. So that satisfaction is a concept that is used in law, not so much in social sciences. When we started doing this, the ICC wanted to know about the satisfaction of the victims, which is not really a term we use in the social sciences. I guess what they mean is there a sense of accessing justice and reparations? But obviously we have, and I think we raised them in the report, very fundamental questions about the durability of what was produced by reparations. This statement from a victim, I think, sums it up. We're in a context that remains extremely violent, extremely difficult, and there are real questions about, how much of that will last in the coming 2, 3, 5, 10 years. So this is in a nutshell what we have in the report, and now I wanted to raise 5 discussion points. The first one I wanted to raise is the sort of perennial question of targeting. Who should benefit from reparations, and what can we learn from the Katanga case? I think a core point in what we seem to find in our research is that Katanga reparations were effective, or at least seem to have changed something in people's life, at least in part because they were very bespoke. We had a small number of victims, a lot of attention given to every victim, and that seems to be what made the difference, really. Which is obviously important when we consider the sort of depth versus breadth type of debate that we always have about reparations. Should we provide reparation to a large number of people, direct and indirect victims, or should we focus to a core small number of victims? In the Katanga case, there was a clear choice that was made to focus on a very small number of victims. There was no mention of indirect victims, but this allowed the process to be extremely targeted, extremely focused. And so this is a process that excluded many people, in fact, right? So is that a problem? I would say that from the field research, the answer is yes and no. I would say yes, because there is resentment in the community. Certainly some people around who were not beneficiaries of the reparations, they're frustrated about the situation, especially victims of Katanga who were not victims in the attack. Obviously, the militia of Katanga didn't stop with that one attack. They were very much roaming around for years. You can imagine there were other victims. These people are obviously fairly aggrieved by the situation. At the same time, I think it may be less, maybe the answer to my question might also be no, in the sense that there is some acceptance in the local community that most of the victims are actual victims of Katanga. This is a quote I put on the slide. It's not like they agree that the process was entirely fair, but there's a sense, it's generally okay. And this quote is from a victim saying 80% of the beneficiaries are actual victims. And we heard things relatively similar to that. It's not 100%. There were some problems in identifying the victims, perhaps, at least from their viewpoints, but it wasn't a big problem. And they agree, well, these people were victims, and therefore it's kind of normal that they receive reparations. The tensions, again, are coming from people saying, well, we live in a context where there's basically no justice there's widespread impunity. So the problem is not so much with people receiving reparations because of what Katanga did. The problem is that there are a lot of people not receiving any reparation because you've got all these warlords roaming around and they're never brought to court. Where I think the tension was a lot more substantial is around the categorization. If you remember, that's my earlier slides where I provided the sort of breakdown of how much money was available for each category. That was an extremely fraught process. That was a very tense process. I put a quote on my slide. People were not satisfied according to their declarations. They were classified according to categories without knowing the standards of these categories. This is from a victim in Bogoro. And I think that what we have here really is a clash of different rationalities, with the judge using a very kind of Western style loss and damage approach, and the victims who simply don't understand that, right? So my second point is, in a sense, I suspect there isn't much of a debate here. It's a question of cash versus goods, the question of in cash versus in kind reparations. There was a decision in the Katanga case to go with goods and services that would be provided by the Trust Fund for Victims. This was not the preference of the victims. There were consultations with the victims. The preference was to have cash. The decision of the judge was, we'll have a bit of cash, 250 USD, but the rest of it we will provide for. And if if you've studied international aid just a tiny little bit, you would know that there are a lot of debates in that space, but also that there's a general move towards cash as seen as providing more agency. And this is very much the same story here, right? A lot of the things we saw, things I think any development studies or scholar or anthropologist would expect to see. Well, people sold the goods that they were provided with because they needed cash or they wanted cash. There were frustrations about and delays about these goods and services being provided. As you can imagine, the ICC is not necessarily the best place to buy cars or motorbikes on the Bunia market, right? So they had to follow Dutch procurement rules to provide that to victims. I can only let you imagine how it went, and it was a very long, excruciating process for many and created a lot of frustrations. So would cash have been better? I don't know. I'm not there to say what would have been better, but certainly there's a recognition at the ICC that maybe cash-based approaches might be useful for a case like this one. Again, I think this is more complex than just going all cash. Next slide. Just one thing on the previous slide, though, related to cash, this 250 USD were so essential in all the narratives that we heard from the field. So it's a tiny amount. It's a fraction of the total people received, but it wasn't a fraction of what people talked about. It was really a key discussion point in all the interviews and all the focus groups. People refer to this $250. This is so important. I could do so many things with these $250, sometimes overshadowing the rest of the reparations. So my next point is about NGOs and direct implementation. And I put a quote from a TFV staff member which I find really interesting, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, really. And the person said, well, if reparations are seen as international aid, then we have lost. And intuitively, I fully agree with that, but I'm not sure I'm finished thinking about it. And a key point that made the Katanga reparations a relative success, let's frame it that way, I think is the fact that it was implemented directly by the Trust Fund for Victims. Now, the Trust Fund for Victims, that I've alluded to a few times already, was not fully equipped to do that. They had to go through Dutch procurement rules. They had to create rules. It was the first ever time that the ICC was doing reparations. There was a lot of learning by doing. But people in Ituri saw that direct involvement of the Trust Fund for Victims as absolutely crucial. In a context like Ituri, like other places around the world, there's a deep mistrust towards NGO and international aid. It's a context that we define as aid-rich. It doesn't mean that there's a lot of aid, but it means that international aid is one of the key industries, and it's been there for a long time. It's not seen as very efficient. You have the peacekeeping mission that is actually leaving. That was seen as a total failure. There's a lot of resentment towards NGOs and international aid. So I think it was really important in that process that the reparations were directly implemented by the court. And this is also what the second quote on my slide is pointing to, this idea of trust in the ICC, the idea of the ICC being the one doing something about their situation. And I think this is creating an interesting tension, because obviously the ICC, the Trust Fund for Victims, are not equipped to organize these large reparation programs. They admit it. They say, well, we really struggle with this. We don't know how we could scale it up. This is quite extraordinary what we did in the Katanga case. Yet at the same time, this is precisely what makes it useful in this case, is because it is not through intermediaries, not through the parties who could be assumed to know better, international NGOs, national NGOs, who know how to provide goods and services. So this kind of fine line between international aid and reparations is, I think, a really important point for debate, and one I've not seen discussed much in the literature so far. Next. So my fourth point is this question of when do reparations start and end. And I think that the data we collected in the Katanga case suggests that we should rethink the timeline of reparations. It suggests that the starting point of reparations is not the reparation order, is not the draft implementation plan. The starting point for victims really is the first engagement with the court in this case. That includes the time they interacted with the court during the investigation. There is very little sense among victims that the ICC or the courts, the chamber, is different from the Trust Fund for Victims, which is different from the legal representatives. They really see them as one, and what matters is the sort of earlier engagement with them. But similarly, I think it's raising questions about the end point. We have, as I think any court case, a few victims for whom closure is impossible, but we also have a majority of people in this case who felt that this is not finished. They felt, well, not all perpetrators were sent to court. And also importantly, they felt, well, we actually are due more reparations. And here I think part of the issue is about the legal language that is used by the court. So the judges explained that the assessment of the value of the harm caused by Mr. Katanga was 3 million, in excess of $3 million US, but effectively they would only provide reparations for $1 million because this is what Katanga should be responsible for. There were other people who were not at the court. They're the ones who should be accountable for the rest. Now, if you want to send a confusing message to people, that's exactly what you do. There were many attempts by the Trust Fund for Victims, by the legal representatives to explain, there won't be $2 more million. But until the end of the process, people kept referring to that. In a sense, you can see why they would be right. Well, our harm was recognized, was established as $3 million. Why are we not getting all that? Especially in a process where Mr. Katanga was recognized as indigent, so basically didn't have the means to pay. So the reparations were paid for by the international community. My last point is about the possibility or the impossibility of reparations in a context of war. What I put on the slide is the number of violent events recorded by ACLED. I don't know if you know them. They're basically recording violent events around the world. It's probably underestimating the actual level of violence. But the point really isn't about the data. The point is about the fact that the level of violence remains very high, and the victims and everybody in the region lives in very difficult socioeconomic conditions. So 44% of the victims said they lost a relative to armed group violence after 2018. Right? So that's a staggering high figure. And it means that effectively most of the victims suffered harm that is very similar to the one they suffered during the Bogoro attack in the decades after the Bogoro attack, right? So that's a really important thing to bear in mind, quite chilling. So there are clear mental health issues amongst everyone, including the victims, a general sense of resignation, and genuine questions about what is the meaning of reparations if there is no peace. And what we heard time and again in almost every single interview or focus group is what we actually want is peace. For us, reparations would be peace. Now, this brings to a fundamental tension because the ICC, the Trust Fund for Victims, almost by definition, are operating when there's a sense that local justice is not effective or is not willing or able to carry out investigations and trials and so on. So almost by definition, we're talking about contexts where there will be impunity, where there may be some violence, but what people really want is peace. And I mean, how much are these reparations contributing to peace would be my question. And can they really contribute to peace? Is it really the mandate of Trust Fund for Victims Reparations to work on peace? Where should they even start? So really an open question here. Let me finish with a few concluding remarks. I think the bottom line of the report really is that the reparations did help Katanga victims overall to some extent, right? There are some limitations to that. And for a time, there's the question of how durable, how sustainable those findings are. And then we have many lingering questions, which we didn't even started touching upon. One is about the consequences of reparations, not so much on the victims themselves, but on the entire community. That's something we could look into. And the question of apologies and impunity I've already touched on. I'll let you read a fairly long quote, and then we can take the Q&A. Not the most upbeat, but I think it touches on the two of the points I wanted to mention to conclude.